Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. 10th of April, just getting ready for the outsiders. Don't know if there's going to be a first moon dog. It's the Pakistani fella standing in today.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Thanks, Barry. Time now for Outsiders. Indeed, joining me today are Catherine McGovern, Senior Associate at the Agenda Group, Van Badham, Guardian Australian columnist, writer and activist, and Zoe Coombs-Marr, critically acclaimed comedian, whose most recent comedy show at the Melbourne Comedy Festival is called Trigger Warning. The latest news poll in Australia this week suggested that the coalition slipped behind Labor for the first time since Malcolm Turnbull became Prime Minister. The poll had Labour leading the coalition 51% to 49% after preferences. The survey had a 2.3% margin of error. Mr. Turnbull has brushed off questions about the figures, but the man who he dumped as defence minister, Kevin Andrews, had this to say.
If the polls are any indication, then obviously that honeymoon period has finished, and that's just natural.
Mr. Andrews drew attention on Monday after comments to a local paper indicating that he would be prepared to serve as Prime Minister. While a number of senior ministers brushed off the poll, Mr. Andrews sounded more like opposition leader Bill Shorten.
When Mr. Andrews says he wants to run for leadership, you know the Liberal Party's in trouble. Now, I never thought I'd say this, but maybe the Liberal Party should have a look at Kevin Andrews. It couldn't be any worse than Malcolm Turnbull's proven to be.
Van, can we see a new Prime Minister? Can Australia survive yet another Prime Minister?
Oh, look, I think Australians are pretty resilient politically these days. I think we can survive just about anything. And, personally, as someone who identifies as being in the left of politics, I think it'd be fantastic if Kevin Andrews was the candidate for Prime Minister from the Liberal Party. I think we'd see, a new red era that could last thousands of years. And I think it's indicative, there's quite a spectrum of political belief in this studio today. And the suggestion that Kevin Andrews could be leading the Liberal Party was not necessarily met with heavy conviction from all of us, which I think probably says everything about his candidacy.
Yeah, so the drop in the popularity began once the government began highlighting plans for the budget. It can be argued that it was the budget that torpedoed Abbott's leadership as well. Do Australians just hate anyone who dares breathe in the direction of the budget?
I think the budget just presents a moment in political time where a whole variety of announcements sort of cease for a whole variety of reasons. That you can't announce things because they're in the budget, they're being worked through. I think there comes this moment where there's this vacuum and people rush to fill a vacuum, and that vacuum's usually filled with negativity and odd suggestions.
Isn't it? I'd also like to put forward that I am happy to take on the role of Prime Minister.
Well, at this point, that's
going. It sort of didn't he? He said wasn't really met with conviction. Wasn't it not even met with conviction by him? Hasn't he gone like, oh look, wasn't he riding a bike or something? He was like, I was a bit puffed, I was taken out of context.
Okay, so you're a comedian, but people always say that about comedians, right? Where they'll say, oh, there's no smoke without fire. Whenever we joke about something, we must have some meaning behind it.
Yeah.
This might just be a case of Kevin Andrews making a joke, but also going like,
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he would. Wouldn't that go? I think that would stand for pretty much any politician. Is like, oh yeah, sure, I'll take the top job. I mean, if it's going, I'm not going to say no.
Yes, it's a bit gags in front of the guillotine, though. It's gallows humour from a lot of the Liberals at the moment. And I'd just like everybody to take a moment to consider that we're seriously suggesting that Kevin Andrews was capable of making a joke.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a new moment in Australian politics.
Catherine, how much is it worth even paying attention to the polls, though? The last British election seems to have pretty basically debunked the effectiveness of polling data, yet our politicians seem to dictate their every action still.
I actually don't think they do that. And I do think, though, that polls are pretty largely irrelevant until they actually have a trend. I mean, one of the questions of the poll is, how are you going to vote if there was an election tomorrow? Well, there's never going to be an election tomorrow until the day before an election. So all these things change. And the question itself is reasonably irrelevant. It's important to ask the question, but we shouldn't get completely obsessed. As I think, I came into the country at the beginning of last week to these polls, having had a couple of weeks without politics. I went, oh my gosh, I was wonderful.
Yeah.
But we actually had all of a sudden this obsession with a poll that's one poll out of a lot of polls over a long period of time, and it just seems out of proportion.
Yeah, Van, there's last week Malcolm Turnbull conceded defeat in the face of of significant state-based opposition to a state-based tax plan, income tax plan.
The
Does he have
3-day-long
any-
tax plan.
Yeah, does he have any way to go from here?
No, he doesn't. I mean, the problem that Malcolm Turnbull has is the same problem that Tony Abbott has, that you're seeing in a period of enormous amounts of distrust of government, particularly around the issue of tax. You're seeing Australia, which is an extremely internationally politically literate culture. I mean, Australians follow what goes on in the United States and follows what goes on in the United Kingdom very closely. And you're seeing a political party, which is, well, two political parties, the Liberal National Coalition, who have policies that Australians fundamentally don't like. I mean, Turnbull, as long as he tries to push I'm going to govern in the interests of freedom, the individual and the market, well, that's not actually what Australians want. More than 60% of Australians are prepared to pay a high level of taxation if that means that they get better schools and better hospitals. Australians don't like privatisation. They don't like any of the ideological economic policies on which Malcolm Turnbull's leadership is staked. And as long as he keeps talking about taxation, well, he's doomed to fail, because until he's genuinely willing to go after tax dodging and taxation unfairness, unless he does commit to increased amounts of money for school and hospitals, until he can provide the services that hardworking tax-paying Australians, overwhelming majority of Australians do pay their taxes and pay very close attention to where their tax money is spent. You can't turn around and say, well, we're going to cut corporate taxation and we're not really going to do anything about tax offshoring, and then take the schools and hospitals away.
Before I move on to the next story, though, Catherine, there's been some nods and shakes. What are you thinking right now?
I just don't agree with the fact that any Australian wants to pay more tax, regardless of what it goes for. People say that they're willing to pay more tax for something. When you actually go out there and suggest raising tax, it is never, ever accepted. It's not something that's popular. But fundamentally, what's far more important in this is you can't keep raising tax. You can't keep adding to the deficit. At some point, we actually need to accept the fact that Australians are spending more than we're giving to government. We need to find a balance there.
But you have as someone who is not particularly, like, I mean, I've just been doing the comedy festival for the last couple of weeks, so I'm probably going to be as insightful as like a drunk uncle at a barbecue. But basically, I mean, I agree with Van there. I think that as someone who doesn't even earn a lot of money, like, I am actually quite happy to pay tax, and I want to pay more tax, actually, if it's going to the right places. And I do think it's an ideological thing. Sure, if you go like, hey, I'm going to take some of your income, people don't necessarily want that. But I think that on a large ideological, state, like, I think that there's something that is just so rotten about this general state of things, and the way of, we have made a huge amount of money through mining recently, and I think that people can sense that that money has gone into people's pockets, and where our health and education systems are failing and we're being cheated. So, and I think that someone like Malcolm Turnbull, who everyone sees as a rich bloke, talking about tax there is just, I think that people find it upsetting, even if you don't know the particulars of it. I think that there's just a distrust. 99 of Australia's richest corporations paid no tax. 99 of them. And you can't continue to say, oh, well, Australians don't want to pay more tax. Australians want corporations to pay their fair share, and for high net worth individuals to pay their fair share. And that's a common international malaise at the moment. That's why there is going to be a new Prime Minister in Iceland. And that's why there are thousands of people outside Downing Street in London at the moment demanding that David Cameron resign.
That 100th company that did pay its taxes is probably feeling very foolish right now. This is Sammy Shaw. You're listening to Sunday Extra right here on RN, and my outsiders guests this morning are Catherine McGovern, Van Badham, and Zoe Coombs-Marr. In other big news this week, the second biggest regional town in South Australia, Whyalla, is on a knife edge after steelmaker Arium was placed into administration. The company employs 1,600 workers in Whyalla, which has a population of roughly 22,000 people. And across Australia, there's 7,000 jobs under threat. The Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, Christopher Pyne, has hinted, however, that the government could save the steelworks company by giving them a contract for building submarines.
Any federal government projects should use Australian steel, especially where it's I mean, sometimes it's not always exactly possible. We don't necessarily make every kind of steel, but where we do, we should be allowed to compete. And of course, because of the government's commitment to the 12 subs, the 9 frigates, the patrol vessels and so on, there will be a whole body of work coming through the pipeline. So I'm optimistic, and the people of Whyalla should not be panicking, and no one should try and panic anybody.
Given that the PM man has said the problems with the ARIUM have more to do with mismanagement by the board and so on and so forth, should the taxpayer we be funding a poorly run company?
Well, what we know is that if we don't rescue these jobs, they will cost more to the economy. I mean, towns like Whyalla and those steelworking, those heavy industry jobs are the economic backbones of entire communities. And it's one of the arguments that's always necessary to make within environmental activism is saying, oh, well, we can have a new industry like tourism or services. They're low paying jobs that don't keep those communities alive. Like one steelworker job keeps an entire dependent economic unit of a family and a community going. And therefore, it's in everybody's interest that we keep those cities viable. Now, if there has been mismanagement or if there has been foolhardiness in investment, it says something about the way that we regulate these industries that are so absolutely crucial to our economic security. And we have to look at, there's a very long chain of responsibilities as how did it get to this. I mean, one of the reasons why those steelworker jobs are threatened is the Australian government has refused to commit to supplying Australian construction projects that are government projects with Australian steel. That's one reason. Two, there's been a flooding of the international market with cheap Chinese steel. Well, what made the cheap Chinese steel? Oh, could it have been all that iron ore that Australia was, racing to export in a fire sale capacity that drove down the international price of iron ore because we massively expanded capacity and got into a bidding war with Brazil on who could supply the most iron? That's what's actually driven the situation we're in now. Economies are intersectional things, and this is one of the great failures of free market economics, is that you now have 7,000 steelworkers, their families and their communities whose very social existence is threatened by this chain of economic
But at the same time, Catherine, isn't there this thing where the government didn't bail out Holden, right? And everything that happened after that as a result. But they did, for example, bail out right next to Whyalla, there's another small town called Port Prairie, where they bailed out a smelting company with $500 million. How do you choose who gets bailed out, who doesn't get bailed out? Shouldn't it be a universal law, or should there not be some systems in place to make a better decision?
I think you should actually have a pretty consistent approach to these things from a policy perspective. I have a view that the human cost, as Van says, of these industries going under or being a threat, the stress that causes to communities, to families, and to individuals is genuinely horrendous, and we really need to recognise that. At the same time, governments shouldn't be in the position of propping up industry. That's not what government's for. Governments actually have to make in place the policy settings correctly, and I take Van's point on that. But actually, governments should not be bailing out companies, whether they've made bad decisions or whether there's been situations where the global economy has changed. That actually isn't government's role. Government's role is to produce a framework for a good economic outcome.
One of the things, Zoe, for example, that comes up in these discussions is the free market attitude, right? Which is basically let the strongest survive. How brutal should we be about those things?
Well, I mean, I guess it's sort of, to me, it seems like there's kind of two issues at hand. One is the sort of industry and one is and the company, which I think kind of, there's a lot of sort of slippery stuff about bailing that out. But also the other thing is about the communities and the jobs there and actually what might be happening. And we've seen it happen in lots of industries where they eventually become obsolete. And I think that the economies change and the actual steel changes and what we need and how we do it. So what is happening in these communities to create other jobs and sustainable industries? And if we're looking at those, anyway, I mean, I'm just rambling now, but what is happening to support those communities? I think that government's role isn't just about the economy, it's also about the communities and about the people and how they support it. Well, I mean, one of the problems is that we don't have cohesive industry policy in this country, and the great mistrick of climate change and policy responses to climate change is that so many years of coalition denying that climate change was even a thing means that there's a gap in an industry policy that could have looked at replacement industries around the construction of wind turbines, for example, around the construction of solar cells, around the construction of electric vehicles. Like, these are all good, solid manufacturing industries, and there are plenty more that could help us make climate targets. But climate denialism has had a serious industrial impact on this country, where if we're looking at transitioning out of those older industries because of market changes or technological changes, the jobs aren't ready for people to go to. We need a just transition to meet the obligations of climate change and to hold up our part of the global bargain. And yet the coalition missed a trick. I mean, Tony Abbott, as Prime Minister, was denying that there was a problem.
And it feels like that's been sort of going on for a long. We're so far.
Okay, upload limit. Back with the new movie.